Good morning. Today I want to instruct you on how a dissociate looks, what the appearance is of a dissociate. And I'm going to be describing a high-level dissociate or two and also a low-level. I'll also be telling you the differences between triggering, cueing, what the high-level dissociate, how it differs from those that have been programmed or conditioned, and how they differ from the simple dissociate. Before we begin, I'm going to pray. Father, I do pray and ask that you bless this time, that you'd open our eyes to the truths that are within your word. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Dissociate identity disorder is a break in the continuum of the conscious mind of the individual. It's the mind and brain's attempt, they collaborate together to create a harmonious congruency in which the person can not only indwell personally inside the mind and body, but also externally how they can cooperate, how they can socialize and be a part of the society structure in which they need to find part of their identity. There is a difference between a simple dissociate and a complex dissociate. A person who has simple dissociation will typically show characteristics such as fugue, when time stops for them and they do something and they're unaware that they've done it because another alternate personality has come to the surface. It may not be a completely developed personality, and see, that's what separates a simple dissociate from a complex, is their personalities will not be completely developed. And by this I mean a complex dissociate will have completely developed personalities, to where they'll have more than one life going on. They'll live several different lives, all which are separated and of which the other personalities are unaware of. Each personality will have its own world, its own realm in which it lives. And that's the internal aspect. It will come out, it will work itself out when they are triggered or cued to the surface in order to perform their role externally in the society that they find themselves a part of, which is a part of their personal identity for that particular part or alternate personality. So, a simple dissociate can be somebody that simply exhibits symptoms of fugue. That means loss of time. And typically it will happen because of an unpleasant experience, avoidance of something that the mind does not want to have to face, anything that may be an insult to the psyche, to the personal identity, something that will cause trauma, duress. Neglect is something that will cause a person to have simple dissociation. Now, an example of a simple dissociate is, for instance, a young child that has not lived long enough to fully develop personalities, but is, say, for instance, in a position of neglect, or is in extreme duress because they're bored or they feel too much stress. For instance, a child that is picked on relentlessly at school may dissociate 10 minutes before recess because of the upcoming trauma, the knowing that they're going to be picked on relentlessly. And so what happens is you will see them, first of all, they will detach. And this is when the child spaces out. Fugue is beginning to happen, which means time stops for everything around them. They detach from the present world, that which is happening externally, and then internally, the rear hemisphere is activated because it is wanting to work through this problem or find a solution to the problem that's coming up. So it detaches and disassociates itself from the moment that is happening outside. So if the teacher looks at the child or another student, they'll look like they have glazed over eyes and like they're not even there, because mentally they're not there. They're disassociated from that area. Now, what the brain may do is to create an identity that can intermingle with them or take the abuse out on the playground. And that alternate personality, will then come out when the bell rings as the child goes out to the playground, and it will take the abuse, and when the child comes back in, it will switch or trigger back, and the other child will look a little glazed over, and they'll come back to it, to reality in the classroom. Now, that personality will never fully develop unless the abuse happens outside in other areas to where it is triggered to the surface, and then it has to take on a more dominant, colorful role. It will not mature unless this happens over the spatial sequencing of the person's life. In other words, intermittent moments as they age. If it just happens for, say, a 3 or 4 month period during the child's life, only on the playground, or a few months, then it'll simply be a fragment. It'll be a fragment of their life, or a still shot to where they've been abused. Now, the reason why this happens is when the child comes back in, it needs to be able to learn because it has goals. It has things that are expected. Its parents may expect the child to get an A or a B in this class. So in order for the brain to meet that need, it will separate the abuse from the classroom. It'll separate the abuse that happens on the playground from the conscious mind that needs to concentrate in the classroom. And so what has happened is an alternate personality, a black and white personality has been created with the role simply to take the abuse on the playground. Another example of a simple dissociate could be in a person that is neglected. You understand dissociation has to happen prior to around circa the 7th year of age, before the frontal lobes are completely developed and seated in their position. And the reason is because the brain, while it's in the developing stage, is unable to deal with everything that it can encounter. And when it encounters something that is too stressful, that is too harmful, it will dissociate. So another example is a child or a person that is placed in a neglected situation, like locked in a room with nothing in it. You say, well, that's insane. I say, no. I was working counseling a woman, and she asked me to come over and talk to her husband. And because of the way he treated the children, she did not elaborate. And I asked if I could use the bathroom, and the son said, well, you can use the one in my room. I thought, wow, that's interesting. And they tried to make an excuse, and I walked with him. I went in his room. It was very much barren. And there was a box that was about 7 feet by 4 feet, 7 feet high. It had a padlock on it. And I said, what in the world is that? This is your bedroom? And the husband then tried to make excuses, and he says, oh yeah, yes, he named the child's name. He says he likes to sleep in a box. I watched the child dissociate while he spoke, glazed over, switched. The child did not like being in the box. The man opened it. There was nothing more than a mattress on the ground in there with a blanket and a pillow. He would lock this child in that box. I confronted the man. The man had put the toilet in the bedroom. Not in a closet, not in a separate room. And there was no ventilation. And it was a form of abuse because he liked to go in there and he would leave it in the toilet to sit so that the boy would have to breathe in the fumes. And unfortunately, I did work with the boy, integrated him because the father, it was a stepfather, finally tried to get the mother to get rid of the child. And rather than sending him away, I asked if I could have him because the stepfather was making outlandish accusations. I said, well, I'll take him for a couple weeks and I'll observe to see how he is. He can live with me and my wife and our children. And the child was a high-level dissociate with an extreme amount of abuse that I had to deal with to work through his alternate personalities and bring him back. When a child is put in a neglected situation, they will space out and they will go and resort to this fantasional world. Because one thing that we all need as humans is social interaction. We have a deep-seated need within our hierarchy structure of needs to feel wanted. We need to know that somebody wants us, that somebody desires us, somebody enjoys having us, to a purpose for our being. And by purpose, I mean that we fit and belong into a family unit, into a social structure, into a community structure. A child that's neglected, segregated, estranged, is under an incredible amount of duress. So we have a fantasional, if you go straight down here and then in here in the brain, area of the brain that works within the fantasy world. And so what happens is the child will dissociate, fuse, time will stop. They will go into that fantasy world by detaching from the real world. They will then go into a different phase, which is called depersonalization, where they depersonalize from their real self and they become a fantasy character. And they can spend hours and hours and days in that area. And if they were to be observed, depending upon the degree of detachment, they would show symptoms of schizophrenic catanesis, or in other words, where they wouldn't communicate. You could move their body around, you could shake them, and they wouldn't wake up. Those type of symptoms. And the reason is they're withdrawing into that fantasy world. The more stress, the more painful it is on the outside, the more they will begin detaching and withdrawing into that world. So those are two areas of simple dissociation. Of course, the most obvious is the person that drives to work. It's a mundane job. It's a thing they have to go through every day. They don't like traffic, so they drive to work and they detach. Their body creates a personality which is fragment. It's just a simple shell that only has the purpose for driving them to work. So while their body is driving, they can withdraw and have thoughts of nostalgia, thoughts of happiness. They can listen to a tune and be just daydreaming, but yet they end up at work, safe, oblivious to the fact that they've been detached from the real world. That is a form of dissociation. And what it is they've withdrawn from the active conscious. The brain has created an alternate fragment personality that's only job is to drive. So if it's a 10-minute drive, they may be spaced out or disassociated for 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes of the drive. So the mundane task of having to drive or put up with traffic, they don't remember it. That tension has been separated and been replaced by good thoughts, happy thoughts, songs, things they're going to do later. Okay. Now, on to the complex dissociate. A complex dissociate is a person who on the dissociate continuum scale, it's where you have 0 and then fragments at 1, which can be body memories, smells, triggers, things like that, all the way up to 4 and 5, which is where you have an alternate personality created that's not fully developed but is a shell that's been formed into a personality, because it's a shell at 3 and 4, which means a hollow, just like a ghostly image. Where you get over to 7 and it's a full-blown personality. It has a style of dress, it has its own appearance, hair, characteristics, traits, joys, likes, dislikes. Has its own role. That is the primary thing that makes an alternate. A shell into an alter is that it have a role and a purpose for being. I'm going to give you the example of an individual I worked with and in the prison system. I was asked to come in and see if I could figure out what was wrong with a specific prisoner. He was just, they thought he might be bipolar, which is a common misdiagnosis among high-level dissociates, because they will show flip-flops. And here's the example of this one. He, on the one hand, was a role model prisoner. He went out of his way to do everything asked of him. He would pick up and clean up after other people. He literally was used by them as a janitor. He would sweep, mop, clean the offices. Respectful, always use yes sir, no sir, yes ma'am, no ma'am. Had a genuine love for people. You could see it on his face, you could feel it in his character. But then on the other hand, like clockwork, there was a couple times during the day, every day, to where he would become a not friendly person. Like a vicious bear or something that you wanted to stay away from. And even the officers, they were afraid of him. They wouldn't even begin to approach him. They would leave him in his cell. And only if they had to go into that cell would they go in, and they would not go in alone. They would go in with several men. So he showed what we'd call opposing traits, opposing characteristics. He had a dual life. That is a number one identifying thing of a complex or what we call a highly developed intellect, a high-level dissociate, is they will have dual lives. Now, they will be unaware of it. For instance, when they would discuss with him in his good role why he would become violent, angry, just mean, he didn't know what they were talking about, and so he would make up excuses for it. When he was in his evil role, he had no idea what they were talking about when they would say, where is this role model? Where's the one? What happened to you? He had no idea what they were talking about. He just wanted to be left alone. So the first thing that I saw is when they came, they brought me to meet him, and he was in the offices cleaning up. And I got to say, I was taken back. The man was only this tall, but he was every bit of that wide across the shoulders and this thick. He was bigger than a gorilla. His arms had to be 24 inches thick, and I mean thick muscled. He was the most muscular man I've ever seen in my life. And as he walked up to me, he had the most loving, smiling. He was like somebody that you'd want to hug or would hug you, but you'd be afraid he'd crush you because I've never seen somebody so muscled. There was not an ounce of fat on his body. I asked him, I said, how in the world did you get so thick? He says, I don't know. I guess, it's just the food in here. Well, in order to find out everything I could about him before making a diagnosis, I talked to a person, they had two other cellmates with him, who when they would put him back in the cell during the day, he was okay, but at night they would just literally cower in the corner. And they said, this man is like nothing you've ever seen. I said, well, what do you mean? They said he gets up at 4:30 and 5 in the morning and does 1,200 push-ups. I said, okay. I said, how do you know? I mean, I thought they were exaggerating. He made one of them count because he didn't like to count. So the person had to count out loud. And he would do a minimum of 1,200, not in sets, straight. The other one would have to count his sit-ups. He would do 1,000 sit-ups then, not with breaks, straight. He would then take and grab the bars and do behind the neck pull-ups by pulling himself up the bars, a minimum of 300 to 500 pull-ups every morning. I've never heard anything like that in my life. I didn't just take the cellmates' words for it. I asked the correctional officers down in the break room, because they are the video room, and they were used to it. For 2 years he had been doing that. And he would even do handstand push-ups sometimes instead of on the floor, and he would still do 1,200 with his holding himself in the air, which I thought was impossible. So it was confirmed The other chaplain there also confirmed it, that this man was like in superhuman strength. High-level complex dissociate will be role-driven. They'll be black and white in their thinking. They will do whatever it takes to succeed in their role. In order for this person to live in that prison system, because this was a maximum prison, it was filled with hardened criminals, murderers, gangbangers that were very, very violent. And nobody messed with him. The gangs did not mess with him. They left him alone. In order to protect himself, he had a guardian who I met face to face that worked out and was insanely strong. The guards could not get him down. 5 of them would try to get him down, and he would throw them like puppets. So the only thing they could do was lock him in, and they would drug him. And see, the problem is they had drugged him, and he had not gone out. He had a violent offense, and basically they couldn't put him to sleep. And for 3 days he had been awake. And because of that, it took them 3 days to get him out. They called me. I went up there the next week to see him, and here's this sweet, loving man emptying trash cans, vacuuming the floors in the offices. And even though he weighed, I would say, every bit of 280 pounds of solid muscle, at least 260 to 280, he seemed to be the most friendly, nicest person. I would trust him with an infant. Now, so I went and I talked to all the different people, and this was about 8 in the morning. About 11 o'clock, he was done with his work. I had finished interviewing everybody. I asked if they could bring him down to a private room. They did. They brought him in a straitjacket, which wouldn't tie all the way because he was so big. And the 2 guards that escorted him in brought him in. They were going to stay. I said, no, please, you can leave. He's in a jacket, and he was also chained to the front, chain running down, chained to his feet. And they argued with me. I said, are you sure about this? We don't believe it's a good idea. They radioed down. The warden gave them permission to leave. And they said, well, we'll be right outside the door. I said, I'm going to be fine. I'd been a federal state chaplain for over 15 years at the time. So as I began asking him questions, I watched him. Now, when a male dissociates or triggers, often they'll do things with their hands. With a female, their eyes will bat up and down like this, like that. Their eyeballs will. That's the typical way that you can tell if a woman's triggering and switching personalities. With the men, it's typically they'll move their hands, their facial expression will change. One eye, because of bicamerality, you'll see a change in expression in the eyes. One will clamp down, one will look very fight, flight, pinpoint or huge. Usually it's pinpoint, the other one will be normal. I watched him trigger and switch. He went from sitting upright like this, being very nice and smiley, to where I can't even mimic it. And he crouched down like this, and he pushed his chair back. And I was looking, it was like looking a great white in the eyes. It was like looking at a huge, vicious animal. The energy radiating from him, I could feel it, just went off the charts. And he crouched down, and even though these tables were basically bolted to the floor, I could tell he was going to try to hit the table and knock it into me. And he said, you're not going to hurt, and I'll use the name John Doe. He goes, you're not going to hurt John Doe. And I calmly, because I now was really worried, I didn't show it. I said, I would never hurt John Doe. He's my friend. I said, I then instantly realized this man's a high-level dissociate. I said, maybe you can help me to help John Doe. That's why I've came all the way up here, several hours drive. And he shook his head. He says, no, that's not how it is. And I said, sure it is. I said, by the way, I'm Pastor Tom. I said, I haven't met you. I said, what is your name? And he told me his name. And his name was totally different from John Doe's. And he was a guardian, and he protected John Doe. So I began working with this man, and I worked with no less than 6 fully dominant rolled personalities. One of the things that will designate and will show a high-level complex dissociate is they will have fully developed personalities that on a scale of 0 to 10 will be at least 7 to 10 in magnitude or strength, as far as intensity. And they will switch to that when their role is needed. I'll continue this conversation later. I have to go to work, lecture, so I hope this has been a blessing to you. Lord bless you. If you have any questions, please feel free to write at my email address. You can get it from my website. You can read about these things in my book, The Complete Big Book on Dissociate Identity Disorder. Not the small one, Volume 1, which is written for just people who understand it. It's more and so the second part, which deals with the mind's intricacies. Okay. Lord bless you this day.